Everybody knows who Maxine Waters is. Yes, everybody. I'm not even going to comment because I can't say anything nice, and my mother taught me, can't say anything nice, don't say anything all. But she is racist. Excuse me. Hey everybody, Weasel here, and time for another podcast. Now, by a show of hands, who feels that President Trump's executive order for a temporary travel hold on those countries was unlawful and subsequently racist? Well, apparently the Supreme Court didn't think so.
Resist! 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 Resist!
I stand with all of you to say, when your rights are under attack, my friends, my fellow New Yorkers, we've got an obligation and a duty to rise up, stand up, and fight back.
I figured I had to come out and say something, make my presence felt, make my voice heard.
Shut it down!
In America, there are Americans that care about the world, and people of all color, race, and religion, and no one's excluded from having basic human rights and dignity.
Finally, people are beginning to take an active part in their government and value their voices and really stand together to demand that, you know, the president-in-chief, the person who should be enforcing and abiding by the laws and regulations of this country, do so if the same is demanded of us.
Now, one thing I want to point out before we lift off here is the word ban up here, immigration ban. Now, this is from back in January 2017, right after President Trump stepped into office. One of the very first things he did he issued that executive order for a temporary travel hold on certain countries that were not meeting the standard of American vetting to allow people from that country entrance into our country and give them visas. So now, bear in mind, and we're going to touch on this and I'm going to show it to you. All right? We're going to look at the facts on this. Bear in mind that the previous administration, the Obama administration, the Messiah himself, issued a near exact, not exactly the same, but very similar order banning, to use their own term, banning entry from these countries. Now, when President Trump stepped into office, he immediately looked at all these countries across the world that are allowed admittance into the country, and he took President Obama's list of these countries and issued his own executive order, which is nearly the exact same thing. And what was the problem? There was a clear threat, potential threat. So we needed to be able to vet these people better. And then back then also we had the situation with Syria and letting refugees in, which I was all for. I still am today. People living in hell, they don't deserve it. Let's get them out of there. After President Trump takes office and they review these countries, they come up with a list. Now, they have told all these other countries, including the ones that were on the ban, that they need to update their security for admittance into our country. Right? Sounds good. Right? Because there is a higher security threat in these countries, and they haven't done it. So what did President Trump do? He did the same thing President Obama did. He issued a temporary hold for 120 days and said, okay, we're going to review this. We're going to come up with an idea, a game plan for all of them. We're going to hand it out to these countries and say, here, figure it out. Let's do this. And when he issued the executive order, of course, the liberal left went nuts. Now, they were already in a tizzy. They've already started their circus, so to speak. That's what I call it. They're Barnum and Bailey. They've already started their circus. So we know that no matter what President Trump does, it's wrong. It's unlawful. It's racist. He's a bigot. He's sexist. We already know. The Democratic Party has no standing with regard to policy, rather with supposed social injustice. That's all they have. Without supposed social injustice, the Democratic Party would not exist. They don't have policy. They don't argue policy. They don't have reasonable, comprehensive, common sense policy. They just don't. Everything's a riot with them. But I digress for now. So let's move forward.
Judge Watson had issued an order that allowed us to be able to file a new amended complaint that challenges the new travel ban executive order that was issued by President Trump. In our arguments, we're saying this is the first time a president has made such a broad, sweeping kind of executive order that bans people purely based upon their nationality. In other words, it's saying if you're from one of these 6 countries, now 6, you are presumptively a terrorist. This over-assertion of powers by the president. The president is not the king. He's not a dictator. We all learned that in social studies.
We all learned that in social studies. Okay, so what we have here is this is then the Attorney General of Hawaii. And this was back in March. This is right after the travel ban, March of 2017. So Hawaii took the government to court based off of President Trump's executive order or temporary travel hold, whatever you want to call it, travel ban, whatever. They said, nope, we're going to stop this. So they go through, guess who? Yep, we're going to hear about them again. The Ninth Circuit Court, all the activist judges, the ones that are in the pockets of all of the liberal left. And so they did. Now, everybody already knows, I already talked about this in the last podcast, the Supreme Court overruled the Ninth Circuit Court and allowed the temporary travel hold. This just happened last week. But we're reviewing and looking back at what happened, because here's my question. I'm trying to figure out, and I really mean this, I'm trying to set aside any of my bias, because let's be honest, I've got bias too. Everybody does. My political views are a lot more conservative than the average Joe. So I'm trying to get in the mind of that far left and find out, where are they finding this basis of racism? Am I wrong? Because it's possible. I'm always open to ideas. When I'm wrong, I'll admit it. Maybe it is racist. Let's find out. So I started digging and digging. Instead of just listening to all the commentators, I decided to start digging myself and looking further into it. So Hawaii decides to take President Trump to court. That's what happened. Ninth Circuit Court interjects and says, nope, this is not happening, and it goes to the Supreme Court. Now remember, at this time, the liberal left was up in arms. The circus was in full force, okay?
The initial ban included 7 Muslim-majority countries: Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. Because of this, it was accused of being, in effect, a Muslim ban. After several revisions, including dropping Iraq from the ban, this latest version includes 3 new countries: Chad, North Korea, and Venezuela, and removes Sudan. Each country will now be under its own different set of travel restrictions. But the US has few visitors from North Korea. Almost all are UN diplomats who won't be affected by the new restrictions. The ban only includes certain Venezuelan government officials and their immediate family members, and less than 200 people born in Chad emigrated to the US in 2015. So why were these countries added? US officials say that only countries who fail to meet new minimum standards for identifying and screening travelers to the US have been included. But critics claim this latest ban is designed to hide the real fact that it is still a Muslim ban, and that by adding new non-Muslim majority countries such as North Korea, the administration hopes to undercut the legal arguments brought against the previous versions.
So was this racist? Was it against religion? Was it to ban Muslims? I mean, they're onto something here, because he had a point. And he said, well, the initial executive order, the countries that were in that executive order were all Muslim. And then by the subsequent third executive order that we'll say was watered down, he had added North Korea and Venezuela and Chad. And so they're not majority Muslim. And it's like, was he trying to cover his tracks here? But I kept going back to one thing. There's one thing that just, I'm not sold on yet. It hasn't convinced me that this was based off of religious bias or racial bias. And that is President Barack Obama, his predecessor. He issued a very similar executive order. And he chose all majority Muslim countries that lacked the security and the identification tools and whatnot to allow these people or give them admittance into America. There was a credible security threat there, a national security threat. So why wasn't the Clinton News Network, aka CNN, or MSNBC, or the Washington Slimes, or the Washington Retard Post, why wasn't the mainstream liberal propaganda machine called the media, why weren't they all over that when the Messiah, Barack Obama, issued that executive order? I don't understand. What made his different than President Trump's? And that's what I'm trying to find out here. So now this next part we're going to read, yes, it does come from Wikipedia. Now, when I was in college, Wikipedia was in no way a credible source, and nor are they still today. My younger brother's a professional soccer player, and he can't even get them to write accurate information about him. So, but for this purpose, they're quoting the New York Times, the Washington Post, those sources. So we'll go ahead and read it anyways. And it says right here, I have it highlighted. Trump's press secretary, Sean Spicer, he was the press secretary back then, cited these existing restrictions as evidence that the executive order was based on outstanding policies, saying that the 7 targeted countries were, quote, put first and foremost, end quote, by Obama administration. Fact checkers, New York Times, Washington Post, and whatnot, said the Obama restrictions cannot be compared to this executive order. Well, why? And here's what they say. Because they were in response to a credible threat and were not a blanket ban. There it is right there. It was in response to a credible threat and not a blanket ban. And I'm going to be honest with you. These people are full of crap. Because here's why. You're trying to tell me now that there is no credible threat for him to issue those executive orders. Yet, the moment he steps into office, he uses all the intel from the previous administration, the Messiah, Obama's administration, and then puts a travel ban, to use their term, on these same countries based off of their intel, the previous administration's intel. So you mean to tell me that that credible threat didn't carry over? And that right there is what I keep coming back to. In all honesty, ladies and gentlemen, this is where I'm struggling. It wasn't different. Sure, it had its minor differences, but generally, it was the same thing. And yes, it was a blanket ban. Why? Because it was, what was it, only 4 countries or 5 countries? Oh, so he added 2 to it? that makes it so different? I'm sorry. This is the problem I'm having. And honestly, if you can comment for me and give me a common sense answer, something more satisfying than the answers that we receive from the liberal media, by all means, please do, because I'm really struggling with this. I'm trying to find why all these people that we just saw here in the New York Times, or here on the Times Magazine website,
Resist!
Look at them. They're screaming, resist, resist. There's a lot of people. These are my fellow citizens. These are people I care about, regardless of their political views, right? I still care about it. And why? What are they seeing that I'm not seeing? Because at this point, I'm starting to believe that I'm wrong in just about everything in my principles, beliefs, and views. I really am. What am I missing here? But I digress. Let's move forward. So there's this wonderful little piece by Daniel Horowitz at Conservative Review, one of my favorite mediums. And if you've been living in a box, get out of that box and go to Conservative Review. If you've never been there, check it out. There are some great pieces there, some great information. I highly recommend it. So we're going to breeze through this real quick. Just a few highlights that I have. We're not going to read the whole article. We're going to skip around. SCOTUS, that's Supreme Court of the United States, on immigration restrictions, a sovereign republic, if you can keep it. Now, why did Daniel, which, by the way, Daniel, Mr. Horowitz, thank you for writing this article. We really do appreciate you. You're an outstanding writer and researcher, so we really do appreciate what you do. Continue doing what you're doing. We'll keep reading your articles. Why did Daniel say, if you can keep it? Let's find out. Congress and the president have the full power to deny entry to any non-citizen or class of non-citizens seeking to enter this country for any reason, good or bad. Those decisions are exclusively up to the political branches of the government to be debated in political realm, and there is no opening for the courts to get involved. Let me repeat that one. Those decisions are exclusively up to the political branches of the government to be debated in the political realm, and there is no opening for the courts to get involved. Now, where is Daniel, the author's basis for this? Let's read forward. The concept is, quote, inherent in sovereignty, end quote, consistent with, quote, ancient principles, end quote, of international law, and, quote, to be exercised exclusively by the political branches of the government, end quote. Unfortunately, while this opinion was a relatively strong win for the president, and he's referring to how the Supreme Court decided to uphold President Trump's executive order for the temporary travel hold, at least the third edition, I should say. The third edition. Unfortunately, while this opinion was a relatively strong win for the president and for sovereignty, every justice but Justice Thomas left the door open for the lower courts and smart, truculent lawfare experts to continue chipping away at the plenary power doctrine protecting our sovereignty. Hold on. And I know it's a bunch of blah, 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 right? I'm going to break it down. We're going to get to it. And we're going to talk about the plenary power doctrine and what exactly it is really quick. Plenary means characterized by being full and complete in every respect. For example, a plenary trial is a full trial of all the issues, factual and legal. Sometimes when a case is held on appeal, the hearing is limited to only questions of law. However, an appellate judge may order the case to be sent back to the trial court to be heard again from scratch in a plenary trial. In reference to a legislative session, it refers to being attended or meant to be attended by every member or delegate. Plenary authority refers to the complete power of a governing body. For example, and here's the example they use here at uslegal.com. For example, in immigration law, Congress, under plenary power doctrine, has the power to make immigration policy free from judicial review. I repeat, free from judicial review. This doctrine was established at the end of the 19th century when the Supreme Court declared that Congress had, quote, plenary power, end quote, to regulate immigration, Indian tribes, and newly acquired territories. The doctrine is based on the concept that immigration is a question of national sovereignty, relating to nations' right to define its own borders. Courts generally refrain from interfering in immigration matters. To date, there have been no successful challenges to federal legislation that refuses admission to classes of non-citizens or removal of resident aliens. So it's full power. It's full authority to the legislative and executive branch, to the governing body. All right, that's what it is. All right, and this was set back in the 19th century, and it was declared plenary powers by the Supreme Court. Okay, so the Supreme Court has ruled on that. All right, now we can go back. What the court was deciding, and I'm getting somewhere with this, ladies and gentlemen. Just bear with me. Let's read through this. Even Trump's original order was not a complete travel ban, much less a ban on Muslim immigration, as it left out 92% of the world's Muslims. It's a very plausible argument. Very plausible argument, Mr. Horowitz. It merely suspended immigration from a small subset of predominantly Muslim countries on a temporary basis due to the rampant concern of terrorist activity. But the order never earned its day in high court. The lower courts won by forcing the president to change his order twice. Many provisions got watered down. All right, so what got watered down? And here's where we're going to see what happened with the provision prioritizing Christians, which I disagreed with, by the way. The president clearly showed that this is all about information sharing, not banning people, because Iraq and Sudan were taken off the list, and Chad, which was added later, was subsequently taken off after it began cooperating with data sharing. Number 2, unlike the first order, no caps were placed on refugees. So they removed the cap on refugees. Remember, Syria at the time, we were accepting refugees. They were coming in. It's just sheer bedlam going on over there. Those people got problems. And in his original executive order, there was that cap on refugees. So he removed that, which is good. I agree with that one. And here's the big one. And the provision prioritizing Christians, which was actually the spirit of refugee law, was removed. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. There's no denying it. There was that provision prioritizing Christians. It was in there in its original, the initial executive order. Number 3, Syrian migration was banned outright in the first order, but not in subsequent orders before the courts. That's interesting. Nationals from all countries on the list are given waivers and exemptions to be brought into the country under the final order. And number 5, unlike in the first order, people who already have visas to enter the U.S. from the countries were not included in the exclusion. So, if you already had a visa, you could come in. So, it got watered down. And you can thank the Ninth Circuit Court, the activist judges, for that. They forced his hand to make some changes. Some of them I liked, some of them I didn't. Great. Thus, if the president was ever wanted to go further to protect our security, a proposition many conservatives support, the lower courts would return to their mischief immediately and say those provisions are not covered by today's ruling. Here's what he's pointing out, and he's getting to it. What he's pointing out is that activists, lower courts, like the Ninth Circuit Court, are going to attempt to say that those provisions that we just went through were not included in the ruling from the Supreme Court. So why would he make it a point to point that out? Well, maybe because the lower courts are going to do what the lower courts normally do and be activists. So they're going to take them right back to court immediately. And we have to go through the whole process again. And look how long it took to get through the Supreme Court. Supreme Court upheld it. It's lawful. You can do it. But here they are obstructing. It took, what was it, a year and a half? It took a year and a half. And so that's what they do. The liberal left uses the court system as its own circus. It's the liberal left's Barnum and Bailey. It's a circus to them. So they're just going to keep hacking away, just pounding and pounding and pounding and pounding. And they're going to make little chips as they go, just little strides. These people are persistent. I will give them that. They are I would give up. But these people are persistent. And I've said it time and time again. They're dangerous. Why? Because this is the stuff they truly believe. They really believe in it. So you can't really fault them for that. They don't give up. All right, let's move forward. For over a year, I have noticed that all other provisions of law, notwithstanding Section 212 of the INA, that's 1182, is clear as a bell and granting the president full power to shut off all immigration and that there are no limits of this power. I repeat, there are no limits of this power. Now, Roberts was almost, now they're talking about Justice Roberts, was almost 100% clear that this provision shuts down any other question of presidential authority, quote, by its terms 1182, exudes difference to the president in every clause, end quote, wrote Roberts. As we noted on Monday, the Supreme Court already addressed and affirmed the unrivaled power of 1182. It's amazing that it took 16 months. I was close. I said 18, right? Year and a half. It's amazing that it took 16 months of wrangling with lower courts to affirm what the court already addressed. That's why I'm suspicious this decision will fully tamp down the lower court shenanigans. Standing. The government rightfully argued that the courts don't even have jurisdiction to review a case denying a visa, and we went over that already with plenary law. However, the majority opinion noted that the court skirted the question for this case and decided it on the merits. I'm happy the judges arrived at the right decision on the merits, but the fact that the Supreme Court is fine with Article 3 courts reviewing denial of visas for people who never even entered the country is disturbing. Remember, plenary law. The courts have no ground, no basis to even consider immigration. It has nothing to do with them. That is the doctrine. But yet what he's pointing out here, Mr. Horowitz is pointing out here, is that the lower courts are dabbling. They're sticking their fingers in it. And that's what's happening. Let's move forward. We're almost done with this article. The 4 liberals are off the wall. And he's talking about the 4 justices. It is simply mind-blowing that all 4 liberals on the court and almost all the forum-shopped lower court judges believe that we have a sovereignty and that there is no justiciable right to enter the country. As Roberts warned in a footnote, quote, What is far more problematic is the dissent assumption that courts should review immigration policies, diplomatic sanctions, and military actions under the de novo reasonable observer inquiry acceptable to cases involving holiday displays and graduation ceremonies. Sotomayor, she was an Obama nominee that the Senate, of course, approved. In her dissent, compares Trump's order to the internment of the Japanese. Well, what better authority on this subject than Justice Robert Jackson, the famous Nuremberg prosecutor who was a champion of the due process rights, wrote the dissent in Korematsu versus United States, the Japanese internment case. That was a long time ago, back during World War II, and was regarded as one of the greatest writers of his time. Due process does not invest any alien with a right to enter the United States, nor confer on those admitted the right to remain against the national will. Let me repeat that. Quote, due process does not invest any alien with a right to enter the United States, nor confer on those admitted the right to remain against the national will. End quote. What is he saying? The courts do not have the right to intervene here. This is out of their realm. This is for the governing bodies. We know that. Why? Plenary law. The plenary doctrine. We should call it, it's called the plenary power doctrine. Overall, the opinion, now here's the key right here. This is where he wraps it up for us. Overall, the opinion for the majority was stronger than I expected. However, I doubt this is going to shut down most of the immigration lawsuits in the lower courts. This is why Thomas's concurrence is so important. It was a note, it was something Justice Thomas added. Until we shut down the lower courts' terrible practice of placing nationwide injunctions on national security policies, a power they manifestly do not have. Let me repeat, a power they manifestly do not have. The left will continue shopping these cases to the same capricious lower court judges. Conservatives in Congress should immediately press for stripping the lower courts of power over immigration, or at least clarifying that they have no power to impose universal nationwide injunctions beyond the individual plaintiffs. The president is now vindicated in the plain language of a statute that should never have been held up in court for almost a year and a half. He'd be wise to invoke 1182 and shut down cross-border migration entirely. Based on universal outcry of the dangers to migrants and Americans, Trump would easily meet the rational basis to test established by the Chief Justice. He's saying he could use 1182, President Trump could use 1182 to legally shut down cross-border migration. He could legally shut it down, and there's nothing the courts can do about it. Why? Planetary law. Planetary law. However, past history should caution us about complacency. These lawsuits are the legal version of a circus. You know what, Mr. Horowitz? You said it right. A circus. Barnum and Bailey style. That's how they're doing it around here. And the victory was a narrow one at 5-4. Unless Congress and the president begin asserting their power over sovereignty, the lower courts will continue chipping away. The Supreme Court will gradually adopt their approach in the ever-evolving one-directional ratchet of progressive jurisprudence. Let me repeat that last paragraph. And this is the whole point. However, past history should caution us about complacency. These lawsuits are the legal version of a circus, and the victory was a narrow one, 5-4. Unless Congress and the president begin asserting their power over sovereignty, the lower courts will continue chipping away. What'd I say? They'll continue chipping away. The Supreme Court will gradually adopt their approach in the ever-evolving one-directional ratchet of progressive jurisprudence. You gotta love Mr. Horowitz's eloquency. Now, there's a little piece that I just want to touch on real quick. This is just a couple seconds, and then we'll call it quits. I'll wrap it up, and then we'll call it a day. Levin, the Supreme Court minority went full Maxine Waters. Everybody knows who Maxine Waters is. Yes, everybody. I'm not even going to comment because I can't say anything nice, and my mother taught me. Can't say anything nice Don't say anything at all. But she is racist. Excuse me. Levin TV host Mark Levin began his radio show Tuesday evening discussing the Supreme Court's decision to uphold President Trump's, quote, travel ban, end quote, executive order. Levin explained that President Trump had every right to list the countries in the immigration pause for national security purposes. Now, you see the language that Mr. Levin used, pause, and I agree with him. Remember, that's what the progressive movement does, the progressive media. They use these little words used to invoke emotion, like calling it a ban instead of a pause or a temporary hold. Anyways, quote, as the predominantly Muslim countries, the Muslim countries with the largest Muslim populations weren't even on the list, left out 92% of the world's Muslims, had added, rejecting the left's argument about racism, end quote. Quote, now, the majority of the court went nuts, end quote, Levin said on a 5-4 decision. They went full Maxine waters. And we'll listen to what Mr. Levin has to say.
The court ruled in the immigration case, as we suspected it would or should anyway, that the president had the authority to identify certain countries from which we would not accept refugees or immigrants for a period of time because these countries had dysfunctional governments. Some of them were at war with themselves, had civil wars taking place. Others had no competent ability to determine what individual was doing what. And, of course, that would make it almost impossible for our own immigration services to determine who these people were and what their backgrounds were. And as for predominantly Muslim countries, the Muslim countries with the largest Muslim populations weren't even on the list. We've talked about this before. It left out 92% of the world's Muslims. 92%. So the court said even facially, there's no racism or discrimination per se in this executive order. And all these arguments about Donald Trump's comments during the campaign and tweets, the court said, have absolutely no relationship whatsoever to the executive order. None. And the banning of Syrian migration, was okay under the circumstances, the court said. And so, also, the president was delegated authority by Congress, plenary authority, to act in this area of immigration. And so, the concern by the majority in the case, the majority decision was written by the Chief Justice Roberts, but there was an excellent concurring decision, of course, by Thomas, who writes beautifully and brilliantly. And they also said, what is the court's what is the court going to do now? Oversee every instance in which a president makes a decision about immigration? And how is the court qualified to do that? Military decisions, geopolitical decisions, national security decisions, economic decisions. The court, the lawyers on the court, are not qualified. They're not capable to make these decisions in lieu of a president of the United States, nor do they have the authority to do so. Now, the minority on the court went nuts. They went full Maxine waters. Full Maxine waters. Now, Sotomayor wrote that this was akin to Japanese internment. How is this akin to Japanese internment when these people aren't even in the country yet? This extra-constitutional, extraterritorial conference of rights on people who don't even live in the country and haven't even set foot in the country yet is insane. And to compare it to Japanese internment camps, there's no internment taking place. None. I've never been impressed with Sotomayor. I told you when she was nominated, she's a left-wing radical, that her opinions as a circuit judge were quite weak, and they continue to be. She is a politician on the Supreme Court. That's what she is. Just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg is an ACLU general counsel on the Supreme Court, and she never fails to demonstrate it. She threw in with this idea that, yes, this was racially motivated and, and it's discriminatory and so forth and so on. The facts don't matter. The facts don't matter. Even though 92% of Muslims in various countries and so forth aren't even covered by the executive order. They're not even covered because those countries aren't covered. Doesn't matter. And so you get reactions from people like Keith Ellison, the deputy chairman, or at least he was, of the DNC. Long, hateful record of bigotry, in my view, against Jews. Long. And his association with Farrakhan, which he attempts to dumb down now. But here's what he said on CNN today. Cut 2, go.
Our country has gone through some ugly days. I mean, the Supreme Court in the 1850s said that it was okay to own a black person. That was the Dred Scott decision. That decision hit the dustbin of history. So did Plessy versus Ferguson. So did Korematsu, and this one will too. I'm telling you, discrimination and racism and hatred and religious bigotry is never going to be winning in the end.
So let's stop here for now. Dred Scott was a decision. Taney was a racist. He was from South Carolina. He was a well-known Democrat that upheld slavery effectively and treated slaves as property and said they didn't even have standing to bring the case in the first place. Dred Scott did. What does this have to do with anything? Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal is equal. That was at the end of the 19th century. What does that have to do with the policy that Trump put in place? Korematsu, the Japanese internment case, what does that have to do with the order Trump put in place? In fact, the order Trump put in place was very similar, almost identical to an order that Barack Obama had put in place. But of course, Obama, again, escaped scrutiny by the ilk and the likes of a Keith Ellison. I've got more. We'll be right back.
And there it is, from the great one himself. Almost identical executive order from President Obama. And I struggle with it. Like, honestly, these people right here from back in January of 2017, these are my, colleagues, neighbors, and whatnot. These are other fellow citizens, people I care about. Look at them. Look at them all. Look at them. They're up in arms. I mean, they're pissed. They're pissed off. Look at them. Stop normalizing white supremacy. Look at these signs. And I wonder, like, when I saw this, it struck something in me. Like, what am I missing? What are all those people seeing that I am missing? That's the question. That's what got me to bring this podcast up today. I don't understand why they see this racism, this, this bias, this whatever you want to call it, that they're calling it, that I don't see. I guess that probably makes me a racist too, doesn't it? But, hey, what am I missing? I almost wonder if these people are motivated by propaganda. You heard the great one say it. The facts did not matter to the minority on the Supreme Court in this case. Facts had nothing to do with it. They bought into the whole, this is racially biased. That's what they did. Even though the Messiah, President Barack Obama, had an almost identical order. Do you see, like, how I feel? How it makes me feel? Like, the hypocrisy is so evident at this point. It's either they're hypocritical or I am flat out blind. I don't, and I'd like to think I'm not blind here because I just don't see it. I really don't. I don't see it, and I think they are part of the progressive left propaganda machine, the progressive movement in our schools and our universities. I remember when I was younger, this is a true story, I'm not making stuff up, I wouldn't lie to you. When I was in school, when I was younger, this is even before adolescence, I had a good friend that I would hang out with. And yes, he was African American. I hate saying African American because the truth is he's American. Period. End of story. But I'll say it anyways for getting my point across purposes. And we were great friends. I'd go over to his house, hang out all the time. Myself and a couple other guys would. We go hang out, have a good time. Didn't matter. Didn't matter the color of his skin. None of that mattered whatsoever. And honest to God truth, I never even saw color. I didn't even see diversity. Like, it never clicked in my brain. Did not even show up. It really did. Now, I did see women, or young girls, of course, obviously. For the obvious reason, no, I wasn't a misogynist and all that crap. I was a kid, but, girls were pretty. I didn't see color. I didn't see I was taught to see color by those progressive teachers. That's what they taught me. And now that I'm older, I go back and fact check things that I was taught and realize that they changed the facts too. But that's a story for a different day. They taught me to see diversity. Now, I don't know if that's good or bad, but I never even saw it. And this is the honest to God truth. I'm having a moment here and I'm sharing it with you. I never saw diversity. I didn't see color. I didn't see race. It didn't matter to me. I see it today. It's almost like the American people are so polarized now. It's like, where do we go from here? What direction are we taking this? Are we pushing towards like a civil war? Is that what's going? Because I keep hearing it. And I keep telling people, oh, shut up, you kook. But the more I'm thinking about it, look how polarized everybody is. There's no tolerance for opposing ideals anymore. It's gone. We have self-proclaimed socialists getting elected into Congress. Yep, another one in New York. Overtook a gentleman who'd been there for 10 terms, which, by the way, it's time he got out of there anyways, so I'm kind of glad, to be honest with you. I'm for term caps, just to be honest. I'm beginning to believe that they are promoting racism under the guise of exposing racism. That's what I'm leaning towards now. And I'm just realizing this within the last week. They are promoting racism under the guise of exposing racism. That's what I'm starting to believe. What do you guys think? Give me some comments. Start the discussion. Just be nice about it. Be respectful. I mean, look at all these people. It's gotta be so difficult to be so mad, so hateful. It's gotta be rough to live your life like that every day. You know what I mean? Well, to wrap it up, President Trump has his travel, quote, ban, end quote, executive order. Hawaii says you're racist. The propaganda machine of the left says you're racist. Clinton News Network says you're racist. MSNBC says you're racist. Maxine Waters says you're racist. Nancy Pelosi says you're racist. Everybody says you're racist. They're coming out of the woodwork. So they tie it up in court in the lower federal courts. Of course, the Ninth Circuit Court takes it. They bite. Doesn't take much for them to bite. You don't have to put bait on the hook. They'll bite. They'll bite the hook. And so President Trump gets tied up for the next year and a half, almost year and a half. Isn't that what we determined it was? 16 months, something like that. Even though, and we're just recapping here so I can end this podcast. Even though he steps into office, he takes the intel from the Obama administration. He takes the past precedent of the Obama administration and his executive order, which was nearly identical. You heard the great one say it himself, Mr. Mark Levin. And out of national security says, look, these countries are going to have to step up their game a little bit before we start admitting more people into this country. Sorry, that's the way it is. There is an obvious risk there. What was the term? Response to a credible threat, and we're not a blanket ban. I don't know why all of a sudden these people think the credible threat had just disappeared when President Trump stepped into office. Well, what sense does that make? So that's what happens. He follows the precedent of his predecessor, President Obama, and now he's racist. And now he hates Muslims. Which he may. I don't know. He may. But the fact of the matter is, what are the facts? Is it legal? Well, we found out with plenary law, the plenary power doctrine, that the president has full power. His full authority. What does it say here? Plenary authority refers to the complete power of the governing body. So the president and Congress had the full authority to do what he did. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the facts of it, We don't have to get too down and dirty with all the facts. We will just scratch the surface on it like we did. It should have been a 9-0 decision in the Supreme Court. But as Mr. Levin, the great one, put it, the minority on the Supreme Court went full out Maxine Waters. And everybody knows what that means. They went nuts. They lost it. Started spewing crap that makes no sense. Facts did not matter. Should have been a 9-0. Should have been a sweep. And so now, Mr. Daniel Horowitz is pointing out that the left is going to continue their circus with the courts. That's what they do. They use the courts like it's a circus. And they're going to continue to chip away, bit by bit. And the Supreme Court will gradually adopt their approach in the ever-evolving, one-directional ratchet of progressive jurisprudence. Well, it was a victory for the president. It was a victory for all America, frankly. Took a year and a half, and it really worries me about the 4 that went against it on the Supreme Court. The Maxine Waters on the court. And if it doesn't worry you, well then tell me why. Give me a comment. I'm kind of curious. I know I'm biased, but I'm always open to other ideas. I want to know what it is I'm missing, because this is the way I'm seeing it. So by all means, please share with me and tell me what it is I'm missing. This is Weasel saying good day.